Over 100 journalists, writers, and media workers took over the lobby of the New York Times office in Manhattan last night, staging a sit-in to demand that the editorial board call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
In a statement, the Times responded, "The New York Times has extensively covered the Israel-Hamas war with fairness, impartiality, and an abiding understanding of the complexities of the conflict. We fully support this group's right to express their point of view, even as we disagree with their characterization of our coverage." But some critics warn that a ceasefire would actually help Hamas. Michael Oren, formerly Israel's ambassador to the United States, Knesset member, writes in a recent Hill op-ed, "For Israel, accepting a ceasefire means victory for Hamas. For Israel, a ceasefire means death, which is precisely why Hamas wants one. If imposed, a ceasefire would enable the terrorists to get away with mass murder. It would empower them to replenish their rocket arsenal and repair whatever damage Israel has so far wrought to their military infrastructure. As in the past, much of the international aid channeled into Gaza would be siphoned off by Hamas to augment its ability to kill Jews."
Here joining us is one of the protesters who was there last night, Elena K Del Junco, writer and professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So it sounds like the protest was not just about demanding the New York Times to call for a ceasefire, which has popularity within the United States. About 65 to 66% of Americans support a ceasefire, as well as the United Nations, Amnesty International. But it sounds like a lot of the writers are upset with the New York Times coverage, really giving a voice, publishing an op-ed on November 5th, making the case to not have a ceasefire in Gaza by Israel. What do you make of the New York Times' recent decisions, and is that an accurate framing of the protesters' qualms with the New York Times?
Yeah, thank you. I think that that's right. So the New York Times, we're asking as a enormously powerful media outlet, particularly, I'll note, in a Democratic administration, as we have now, to influence the public opinion, but the public opinion already stands behind a ceasefire. So really we're calling on the New York Times to step up and take responsibility in using its editorial board's power to call for a ceasefire, which the Biden administration has so far refused to do, but also, as you say, to improve its coverage, which, contrary to the Times's statement in response to our protest, while extensive, is hardly fair or balanced. The New York Times, of course, is one very important media outlet, but it's not the only one. And so we're choosing to target the New York Times because of its prominence and influence. But this is also symptomatic of the media landscape as a whole. So this equally applies to outlets like the Washington Post, CNN, network television, CBS, ABC, NBC, et cetera, to say nothing of outlets like Fox News or the New York Post. So while the New York Times is a particularly important target, we're really using this attention to think about the media more generally and the role they play in making it impossible for a ceasefire to take place and contributing to the conditions in which many more thousands of Gazans and Palestinians will lose their lives.
To play devil's advocate a bit here, the New York Times has also been accused by Israel of having advanced knowledge of Hamas's October 7th attack that killed 1,400 civilians, saying that the presence of photojournalists who were embedded with Hamas on that day meant that they should have given some kind of warning to Israeli defense forces. And also, the New York Times had to issue a correction in an editor's note previously when they claimed that that hospital that was bombed in Gaza was bombed by Israel, when it ended up being, according to U.S. Intelligence sources, an act of a rocket coming from Gaza basically being misfired. So I'm not sure I buy the argument that the New York Times is somewhat aggressively pro-Israel or not representing both sides of the conflict accurately. And I'm loath to defend the New York Times, but that's been my perception of it, at least. What's your response?
Well, I think there's two specific points that you raise. So Israel and the United States both have one of the most sophisticated, or two of the most sophisticated intelligence operations on the planet. If the New York Times had advanced knowledge of this attack, it's inconceivable to me and to anyone else that the Israeli intelligence forces and the US intelligence forces would not have advanced knowledge of that attack. So That's one thing. The second point, you raised the issue of the hospital, actually a hospital in Gaza, which was bombed. The New York Times immediately issued a correction, or what they called a correction, to repeat the Israeli line, the American line, that the hospital was not bombed by Israeli forces. Well, that was in the focus, well, that was on the front page of the world's news. A few days later, the New York Times published an extensive article showing that the evidence provided by the Israeli and American intelligence services indicating that the missile that targeted the hospital came not from Israel, that evidence did not support the Israeli assertion. So the New York Times ended up, through their own reporting and analysis, having to walk back their reprinting and stenography, their parroting of the information or the assertions provided by the Israeli army, who's been known to issue simple falsehoods to the media.
I want to talk about the hospital bombing, the Al-Hahi hospital that became a central focus of mainstream media. We're aware of, Israel bombing refugee camps, dropping 6,000 bombs on Gaza when there's 2.2 to 3 million civilians. But this became the central focus because it was initially reported by an IDF spokesperson that this was a bomb dropped on the hospital through an Israeli airstrike. Then that post was deleted, and the Israeli spokesperson said that they got their information from Reuters, which is shocking because I would think an IDF spokesperson would have the best intelligence on what the IDF military is up to. But the New York Times ran with the story and then subsequently had to pull back on that story and then again produce some analysis of the live feed of the rocket fire exchange between Gaza and Israel that night. And they said the jury's out. We're not really sure who did this. It's very possible it was an Israeli airstrike after they reported on a lot of the speculation that was parroted by the administration that this was a Hamas detonated bomb. It was misfired coming from the hospital. It sounds like the New York Times has not done a great job backtracking when they falsely reported, and they've now seemingly taken this approach of using neutral language. There was an explosion at a refugee camp. There was an explosion at a hospital. And this recent response from the New York Times sounds like they're making the case to not have a ceasefire. It sounds like they're using neutral language when Israel is the aggressor and providing actually defense for the arguments that the Israeli military is making to not have a ceasefire. What do we make of this as journalists? Because I don't think it's our job to parrot both sides. It's our job to listen to both sides and report on what we know to be the truth. It seems to me like that's not happening at the New York Times. What do you think about all of that? What's your response there?
Sure. So it would be bad enough if the New York Times or any journalistic outlet were simply parroting or repeating assertions from both sides. The fact is that they're repeating assertions. They're parroting one side in this conflict. I think, as you illustrated very well, that they will issue corrections as the Israeli intelligence service issue putative corrections. I think that they're not only parroting the Israeli assertions without doing any fact-checking of their own, despite the fact that they're perfectly capable of doing so. They're capable of doing their job and they're failing to do so, but they're actively using language that dehumanizes Palestinians and essentially makes it impossible to hold the party who is responsible for the mass death, the over 10,000 deaths in Gaza, responsible for that catastrophe, this humanitarian disaster and unfolding genocide. So you referenced a headline, and I think it's worth reminding the viewers what that headline is. So after several 2,000-ton bombs were dropped on the Jabalia refugee camp last week in Gaza, where thousands of people had taken refuge and have lived as refugees for decades, they published the headline, "Explosion Gazans say was airstrike leaves many casualties in dense neighborhood." Now, there's no question, there's no controversy about where this explosion came from. The Israeli army confirmed it. So an accurate headline would look something like, "Israeli airstrike kills hundreds in crowded refugee camps." It's very easy to write a headline. I trust that the journalists at the New York Times are literate, media literate, and capable of writing an accurate headline. They have access to information, and they are choosing not to do so, just as the editorial board is choosing not to call for a ceasefire and supporting the Israeli and American refusal to acknowledge the value of Palestinian lives, quite simply.
The New York Times over the past few months has seemingly been resistant to respond to protests of this nature. Previously, there were some trans activists who showed up several times outside of the New York Times headquarters, claiming that the paper was responsible for anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ plus reporting. And the editorial board, the editors of the New York Times responded by actually chastising staff members who were coordinating with those protests. So do you feel optimistic that the Times is going to respond to your activism?
The Times is a behemoth, and it's part of the American media landscape. It's part of the American public sphere. It's not an official state media as one has in other countries, but it plays the role that state media have in republishing, in repackaging, in repeating whatever line the American and now the Israeli government provides. So it's going to be very hard to move them, but I do think that it's precisely the reason why this sort of action is important, but also that this sort of action needs to be repeated, that groups need to continue keeping the pressure up on the Times and other similar organizations, and also to use their voices, to use this sort of action to target the Times, but also to raise awareness among the public, not to trust, to undermine the credibility of the Times, that their credibility is going to be harmed unless they make serious steps to correct their course, both in their putatively factual reporting, but also in their editorial line.
All right, thank you, Elena. We're going to leave it there. Thanks for joining us on Rising.
Thank you so much for having me.